There is blood. Oh, there is so much blood. Yes! You will be the great Khan of Khans, descendant of Genghis Khan. These are the words of the shaman who saw the future of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Now, decades before he was who he was, the preeminent enemy, Kalki incarnate against the Red Threat, he was just a little boy in Graz, Austria. I love Ungern. He is a personal, great, first of all, personal character, a martial character, probably Mars incarnate, Kalki, or at least a prophet of Kalki, right? A great destroyer and purgator of communism, and I firmly believe that I am his descendant, spiritually speaking. Now, the origins. Let's get back here to this original Colonel Kurt, of Apocalypse Now, right? He is the real life version of this. He was actually born in Graz, Austria, in the turn of the century. So he was born in 1886 in fin de siècle Europe, right? And Europe at this time it was as it is now, right? It's like it's fucking lame and very effeminate, very bourgeois, which is one and the same thing. And ultimately, what ended up happening, it just meant nothing. There was this era of great liberalism and happiness and all this lame stuff and revolutions and killing people and their betters and all the slave masses rising up like the disgusting beings that they are. Oh, I'm so disgusted. But he was born during the time that this was all changing, and that there was a transition from this stupid, sentimental, romantic period of Europe into what is in the German sphere the Volkisch kind of movement, and in other places it was called like a theosophy or Ariosophy or whatever the hell it's called. But the thing is, people were searching for means of spirituality which were more genuine and outside of these controlled bugman institutions which preach constant peace and love thy neighbor, all this hippy-dippy bullcrap, right? It's all communism. Anyway, he was born there in Graz, in Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He has no memory of that because immediately so there's this concept called the Reichdeutsche, right, which is basically people who are of the general German sphere, who are German themselves, that live abroad, that are not in the German sphere. So Graz is technically outside of the traditional German homelands, and ultimately speaking, you know, he would move, his dad would get a job in Russia as an administrator, which is actually kind of in line with the Russian tradition, since Peter the Great, in fact, Peter the Great actually imported a crap ton of Baltic Germans to run important infrastructure and to create the first industrial base in Russia, because I mean, we know how Germans are spurgy, and they're like very detail oriented, and for whatever reason, everywhere they go, they're like little dwarves that make gold and stuff. And so ultimately, there's a significant German community in Russia. I think even to this day. Unfortunately, World War II saw really bad things happen to them, and that really is terrible. But either way, the truth remains, and so basically his parents relocate early on, basically to Tbilisi, Georgia in 1890. And mind you, it's very interesting how he would cross paths with Stalin. Stalin is from Tbilisi, Georgia, and he was on scholarship at a private school that was run near the governorate, and people like him would rub shoulders. Now, Stalin's a little bit older than Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was at that time, and they probably never saw each other, but it's very funny that, like, in this nexus of a frontier post, let's say, of the Russian Empire, they happen to cross paths, two titans of history. Now, moving on, basically his dad dies and his mom remarries. He goes to the Baltic countries and spends his entire boyhood in Estonia. Now, Estonia, just for the record, is like, it's a place, so it's Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and these estates were called the Western Lands, or Estland, by the imperial governorate, and they were operated as one province. Now, there was a significant German community there all the way through World War II, and I believe it still continues to this day, because of the crusading history and ultimately emigration to these lands of the Baltic lands, which ultimately are also where the majority of the Junker class was made. Now, he was the son of a Junker. His stepfather was an individual who was of wealthy means. He lived on a mansion with estate with servants, and just being the way Germans are and part of the Junker ethic, his father would actually work, had his own industry, etc., sell, his crops, market, etc., and it was part of this old world. And I'm assuming it made a lot of difference. And he wasn't into this whole book learning thing, and a lot of aristocratic boys aren't. In fact, if you're a virile man, it's very difficult as someone with boundless energy to go out and just be in a book, be a shut-in. And so he spent a lot of his time, writing, hunting, doing all these things aristocratic boys usually do, and had private tutoring lessons. Now, it's apparent he never really did too well at school. It's probable that it's mostly because of the fact that he just hated school. And at school, he actually got a reputation for bullying, and then also bullying the bullies. He was just the Primarch of violence. So that's just an early indication of his aristocratic virtue, of his ability to be a warrior, to take pain and inflict pain, So it's very interesting origin story. It's interesting that so many momentous figures come from this specific warrior land. But time went on. He got to the point where he was 15 or 16, and he was just too much. And so ultimately he was sent to the St. Petersburg Military Academy. And just to give you a feel of what turn-of-the-century Russia was like, nationalism was taking its hold over the countries of Europe and everywhere else. And so what it used to be is that in Russia, the administrative language obviously was Russian, but in day-to-day it was French. It was very aristocratic that way, cosmopolitan. Now, due to the nationalistic impulses of the time, Russian was being enforced, and people were being Russified. And in other places, like in America, it was anglicized or Americanized, whatever you want to call it. German, it was Germanicized, etc. There's this feeling of Greater Russia to build the satellite peoples of their country into Russian subjects, to be at least culturally Russian, if not ethnically so. Now, that was a significant issue because Roman actually primarily spoke German, and then he also spoke Estonian, right? Or Latvian, or I forgot what it's called, the term, but basically he was not very well versed in Russian and had to learn from scratch, which is actually a very funny situation. It's like having been raised in the United States and only speaking Spanish. Ah, wait. That's like basically America right now. Ridiculous. But any case, so effectively he didn't do too well. There was enforced theology school, and he liked religion class, but it was too cookie cutter, right? Too much rote memory and stuff. Anyway, long story short, at this military institute for kids, basically the majority of the emphasis was on discipline. So discipline every day, getting up, marching around, doing drill, doing reveille, basic infantry drilling skills, and with an emphasis on unquestioning obedience to orders. Now, of course, this is extremely important as a military man. However, one of the most important or difficult things to admit is that it is incredibly boring, and you probably want to watch paint dry on a wall instead of doing this stuff every day, day in, day out, Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday you go to church. But in any case, so that was his boyhood, and he did not do well. He failed with flying colors. He got straight Fs, and ultimately was sent back home to Estonia, to a lot of his personal dismay and to the dismay of his family, who were severely disappointed at him. But luckily for him, fate intervened, and the Second Russo-Japanese War had broken out in Manchuria, and he immediately takes the initiative and enlists, heads out, and sees the wider world. Young Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. And so he gets the acceptance of his stepfather, who was his nominal legal guardian, because back in sane times we don't let women raise children, because that is absolutely stupid. But anyway, let's see here. Bop, 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 bop. Okay, there we go. So he gets through Manchuria, and effectively, you have to remember that back then, borders between nations weren't as solid, so it was kind of like a drifting borderlands, which denoted the boundaries of a nation. And so battlefields would be fought in what was actually King China, right? Qing, China. However, it would be fought between Japanese forces and the Russians, or it would be fought, in Vladivostok, or it would be fought in Korea or Northern Korea at that time, and Port Arthur, etc. And so a lot of this give and take happened, and I have to remind you that the Russo-Japanese War was perhaps turn of the century Victorian warfare is dystopic in a way that you probably don't understand. Not in a condescending way, by the way, but like in the modern era, we talk about Ukraine all the time, and you see like, oh, waves of Russians, charging into gunfire or whatever. Well, that's not really true. It's an exaggeration. However, let me tell you the difference, is that the Victorian era saw a transition from the original Napoleonic, standing in a line and then marching up to your enemy and then waiting to fire until you're ordered, and then fire in volleys, right? Now, the Victorian era was still transitioning, so the first squad, modern squad tactics, for instance, cover and fire, buddy rushes, stuff like that, things that you learn in basic infantry school, which, by the way, for those of you who are civilians and don't know, a buddy rush is basically a two-man pair, effectively lay down fire, one lays down fire while the other maneuvers, either charges forward or pivots or retreats, etc. It's called bounding movements, and basically this can be scaled up. So buddy on buddy, individual on individual, or fire team on fire team, which is 4 men doing it for both teams, correct? And then finally platoon, company, battalion, etc. I think at battalion is where it ends, and basically that's where the operational level kind of starts. Now, in the Victorian era, especially in countries such as Russia, which were technologically less advanced, especially in military aspects, they were stuck in this semi-holding pattern, which is you should see like these like Russian bayonet drills where columns of men in like semi-loose formation but in line would walk across a plain towards the enemy, walk straight up. Like, I'm not exaggerating. They would walk under fire and not seek cover, and basically the officer would be in front with the sword and the guys in the back would be up with their rifle and just walking at a position held by an enemy. And by that time people were, you know, doing shallow foxholes and entrenchments, etc. And like it was this way between both the Russians and the Japanese, give and take. It was insane, and the casualties from the battlefield were high, but it's not just the deaths from the battlefield that are extremely high. It's the deaths from medical malpractice, even by the standards of the time, of failure in logistics, failure to give proper medical treatment to individuals, and treating basically all pain with opium, which causes huge addiction problems if you survive, but if you don't survive, it actually causes issues with if you administer a dose that is too high with your cardiovascular system, etc. And so, without getting too bogged down, I want you to understand it's just a mud slog. And being in the infantry or the artillery or whatever, in the land forces of an army, there's a reason why there's this connotation that army people are stupid. It's because ultimately the only people that you could get to go into the armed forces of the army were themselves the kind of the trash heap, the rejects of the world. And it's an unfortunate take. I love military stuff. I love, you know, soldiering and stuff, and I kind of take I take this blandishment with some resentment. But I would say this: it is kind of true, unfortunately. But for this time, obviously, I don't think it's true for every time, and especially not true for now. Now, this is the scene that Roman comes into. He serves as a corporal in an infantry regiment, does the thing. He gets actually a Medal of Valor, well, minor valor, right? Basically for having participated in the campaign, saw action, and effectively served his time. And this was incredibly... Oh, and by the way, he served in the 91st Dvensk, if I pronounced that correctly, infantry regiment, and got the service medal, as I said, and basically this was a formative experience. Now, the Far East was entrancing for people all over the world, especially of the legation cities in China, the great powers everywhere. But it was a place where East and West crossed, right? Like, especially the Russian borderlands, where, you know, the Russians are Europeans and they would go over into China, and then it was very, you know, traditionally Chinese before the communists took power, and, you know, the Japanese, etc. And so there was this huge, like, crossover in ethnic layers. And if you're not familiar with Dugin, I think a lot of Dugin's thought comes from this time of this Eurasianism or whatever, where it's this blend of, like, European and Asian elements. This is not my personal conviction, I'm just giving you background just for the record here. Now, what's interesting is that Roman here develops his spiritual beliefs here as well. He's very interested in theosophic circles. He's interested in, you know, traditional Confucius and Buddhist religions held by his basically compatriots. He is interested in the Lutheran upbringing of his background as well as the Orthodox, etc. And so there's this just giant mesh of spiritual inspiration which he was exposed to, as well as a larger cultural context outside of Europe himself. And on top of everything, he became enamored with the idea of the Mongols and with himself as a military man. Now, he returns, kind of an older, more mature man, more disciplined, and he decides he knows what he wants to do, and he goes and basically goes and into a military academy which breeds young officers. It's a little bit longer than what we're used to today. It's like 6 years or something like that, and so ultimately he does that, right? And he actually did pretty well for someone that consistently got D's and F's in his academic career. He pulled a solid C and B minus average, which indicates that he has, you know, intelligence. Just sounds like after years and years and years of not studying, it kind of takes its toll in atrophying your brain. He basically graduates with high military marks, so there's like you know, there's academic marks, military marks, which are like discipline, boxing, all this kind of other stuff. It's actually kind of cool. I'll pin a link in the description below of the general curriculum of the Virginia Military Institute at the turn of the century. It's very interesting, and I think it's something that every young boy, even man who hasn't been exposed to it, should just kind of expose to himself and do. Now, obviously, there's a Theosophic circle that was in St. Petersburg at that time, and he became incredibly involved in it for someone that was a, you know, officer in the Imperial Army, which is kind of like, it was accepted, but it was apparently kind of weird how much he was involved in it. Next, he graduated and was assigned, he was assigned to the Tashkent Cossacks, right? And the Tashkent, so that's, if you remember, the Russian Empire had, so you know those Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, if I've missed anyone, please forgive, but basically that entire region was conquered by the Russians and part of northern Afghanistan. Now, Tashkent was the significant posting of an imperial frontier post like Tbilisi was in Georgia, and that's where a lot of the military operations against Persia and the British in Afghanistan and India took place from. Now, you know, Russians with Attitude is a podcast that has good Russian history about this. There's this whole story about how the city of Tashkent actually was taken. It's very cool, but I'm not going to go into detail here because this is about my favorite anti-communist. Now, he chooses instead to go to the Transbaikal Cossacks, which the Transbaikal is where, so there's a place called Lake Baikal, and that's located dead center north of Mongolia. If you look at a map, it's huge, you can't miss it. Now, to give you context, the Cossacks are a military institution, or caste. People think, okay, people make a mistake in the East, or in the West, to say that they're an ethnicity or whatever. Like, for instance, we talk about Russians and Cossacks, modern Cossack societies, etc., of individuals who are Cossacks fighting for the Russians. Now, like, it really kind of isn't and is. So, you kind of see this in the American military, where generation after generation of individuals like live in these communities, and then they reproduce, and their sons serve, and their daughters marry other Cossacks, and etc. And so what happens generation after generation is this new formation of a people, of an ethnos, right? And originally, like, Cossacks don't just come from Slavs, even though a majority of them do. They're also Buryats and Mongols and hell, some King Chinese and some Manchus and you know, Germans and whoever was in the imperial domain serving in the Cossack detachments. The Cossacks are kind of like, and they're different from the infantry, right? Because the Cossacks they're like rangers, and their purpose was to maintain the frontier on horseback, and be self-sufficient, right? It was like Peter the Great's innovation to provide a self-sufficient force that was frontier-oriented, and that was self-sustaining and cheap on the budget. You know what I mean? And the Russians have always been plagued with logistical issues and financial issues, so this is one of the innovations. And so this is the environment that Roman comes into. This is the place where he earns his stripes, and he loves it. He loves it. He spends all his time. He was not a very good officer in the sense that he didn't do what all the weesh, small chins, officers wanted to do, is basically sit and have galas and dance and all this kind of fucking bourgeois crap that was happening in the turn of the century. No, he was a real warrior. You know what he did? He spent all his time with his regular men, picking fights, drinking, banging whores, doing all this cool stuff, living a raw and real soldier's life. And that was, the thing that stood out to me about Roman himself, but also my experience in the military, is that a lot of the guys that were actually good soldiers tended to be of this way. Now, don't confuse it, okay? Right? Like, just because it is the case that this guy did it doesn't mean necessarily that you're a bad soldier if you do not do it, or not bad warrior. And vice versa. Just because you do these things doesn't mean that you're a good soldier. But I'm just saying that the trend is there, that I have noticed that there's a correlation between the two. Why? My personal suspicion is that high testosterone tends to lend itself to exploits like this. But this is getting a little bit too far. This is no big deal, though. However, in one of his early duels with another cavalry officer, so back then there was a duel, if you felt offended or whatever, you just fucking duel to the death. No, you wouldn't duel to the death. It would duel to first blood or until someone asked for mercy or something like that, which was hardly ever. And effectively, he landed a brain injury for the rest of his life, had excruciating headaches, like blinding headaches, and significant departure from his mood changed, and like he was already a dark figure beforehand. Now he was just incredibly cruel, or crueler since then, and so it became more severe, and obviously probably part of the reason why is because he was feeling constant pain, right? Now, anyway, he enjoys his time, and then suddenly, you know what happens. 1914 comes around, and the First Great World War occurs. Isn't that crazy? And so, immediately, he is assigned to the West and fights in the campaigns against Austria, and then later against the Turks. I'm not going to go too deep into it. However, it is to be noted that during this war, Roman comes into his own. He wins various medals of valor and courage and outstanding initiative, etc. He earned the equivalent of the Medal of Honor, fighting for the Russian Tsar against the Austrians. Basically, oh, and by the way, the cavalry units of the Russian army would suffer, I think, 60% casualties compared to the 30% casualties of the infantry, and he was always leading from the front. In fact, he was noted for being the kind of guy that was exceptionally brave and would volunteer for insane head-on attacks on entrenched positions from horseback. And that's just, I mean, it's incredible to me, but you have to understand how crazy it is. I don't know if you guys have watched this, All Quiet on the Western Front. Again, if you read anything from World War I, please do not read the defeatist All Quiet on the Western Front. It is lame, but the recent movie by Netflix gives you a background as to what combat was like, obviously from a defeatist's eyes. However, I would say this, that it is very interesting to see, like, you know, the way that machine guns were employed, artillery, how kind of dystopic it was after a time, how muddy things could get, and that was true on the eastern on the Eastern Front. Especially the Russians suffered from a lot of logistical issues, so there was a standardization, Jesus, of forces and equipment and material on the German side. Again, that God-given spurred talent of mechanization, etc. Now the Russians were stuck with a whole milieu of rifles and calibers and ammunitions and this and that, and so what ends up happening is that, yeah, you might have a rifle, but you don't have ammunition for that rifle. Alright, you need to, you know what I mean? Like, there are so many issues that a lot of the time units couldn't fight because there wasn't a standard issue, right, across all of the military forces. Now, he wins, and he kind of, all this stuff happens, and a lot of the elements that were causing the collapse of the Russian Empire were being brought to a head, and ultimately the revolution, the Red Revolution, right, happens against the Tsar. He's deposed by the Bolsheviks, and ultimately at Brest-Litovsk, people like Lenin sue for peace with the Prussians, and the Prussians sign an armistice in 1917. And you have to remember, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, people say reactionary or conservative. This is a slander, okay? Never call yourself a reactionary, a traditionalist, a conservative. That's a losing mindset. He was an idealist, okay? He was a spiritual idealist, and that is the main difference between left and, quote-unquote, left and right? Which is really the below and the above. One is an emphasis on material, and the other is the emphasis on spiritualism. And now, he was a huge proponent of the Tsar. He supported the Tsar, even in his, let's say, abdication and basically his incarceration at his home residence. And effectively, so in the Russian Revolution, remember, and you should read this book, it's called The Russian Revolution by Sean McMeekin. He is this professor at Hillsdale College, great college, very, you know, how do you say, just Ubermensch, you know what I mean? It's an Ubermensch titan of history. However, he kind of exposes the lie of the Soviets and the communists. And now, there are two revolutions that happen in Russia, right? The one in 1917, which deposes the Tsar, and with the leadership of Stolypin, becomes a republic, or nominally so. And then, roughly 4 or 5 years later, 1920, parliamentary disagreements become conflicts, armed conflicts, and these armed conflicts become a second revolution, the Red Revolution, right? And so the communists are an issue, and then later, after this story I'm going to tell you, there was a third revolution, which is the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. So one was deposing the Tsar. The second civil war, which we're about to go into, is the Whites, which compose of liberals like Stolypin, all the way to like hardcore monarchists like Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, against a coalition of communists and socialists, which includes both Bolshevik and Menshevik factions. And then once the White Army loses, then there's a third, which the Bolsheviks annihilate the Mensheviks and effectively create the Soviet Union under Lenin, and then finally Stalin. Now, that's a lot of information for a time that is in the future. I'll do a review of these events later, but let's return here to the story. Now, during this time of upheaval and peace, or quote-unquote peace, Roman decides to return to Ataman Semyonov headquarters down in Tbilisi, and that's where they chill. They hang out there until roughly, effectively, the Second Russian Civil War breaks out in the attempt to reimpose the Tsar onto the Russian Empire, etc. And effectively, Semyonov, who is the army general, he assigns Roman to go back to Transbaikal to raise a Cossack troop, Oriental, I think it was the Manchurian division, and effectively raise foreign element forces, so Mongolians, Buryats, Manchu, etc., into a fighting force to fight on the behalf of themselves to go and attack the Soviets, or rather the Reds, right, at this time. Oh, and remember, there's an American expedition called the 1917 Polar Bear Expedition to help stabilize and fight off the communists in Vladivostok. People don't know this. 10,000 Americans fought in that kind of civil war. It's pretty interesting. Now, he continues and he kind of breaks discord. As the war progresses, things are very one-sided. The Bolsheviks have massive support from the lower classes, which far outnumber the aristocracy and so on. It's a big slave revolt, right? That's really what it is. It's a slave revolt. And Roman decides, you know what, okay, this is probably not making sense, so what he's going to do is attack into Mongolia, which was nominally a dominion of King China, and reimpose the nationalist Mongolians' Khan, the Bogd Khan, I think it was the 8th Khan, the living Buddha, back onto the throne, which he does successfully, and with great panache, and basically annihilates a superior Chinese element defending that city. And I mean, he completely takes it by surprise, and it's funny because the majority of that garrison that had defended against Roman had actually deserted before he had engaged them in combat. Now, like, we all know the fighting standard of the Han Chinese, it's very low, but like that's still an incredible feat. You know, being outnumbered 10-1 is a pretty incredible feat. Now, moving on. He takes over, reimposes the Khan, reimposes the Buddha, takes on a special smock. I'm sure if you've seen a lot of the depictions of Roman, he's in this smock, which is an oriental smock as a brigadier general, and his standard, you should see his standard, it is really cool. It's like symbols of both orthodoxy and, you know, Hinduism and Buddhism and all kinds of Eastern mysticism and stuff like that, and it's all into one thing, which is almost schizophrenic, but it's actually beautiful. You should see it. And effectively, during his time in Buryat, he consulted a shaman who said those words to him at the beginning of this segment here, and basically it kind of inspired him, and he believed himself to be the descendant of Genghis Khan. And fun fact, to this day, there's this huge statue of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg in Mongolia. The Mongols love him. And what ends up happening is basically he takes control of the Mongol state for about a year or two as the Grand Duchy, or the Grand Duchy of Mongolia, and he makes constant raids and attacks upon Red forces, communist forces coming from the north. And at that point, the war had really waned on. The white forces had effectively retreated in the west, and it was kind of a rearguard operation going on. It was really kind of sad, honestly. But he fought anyway, and he had a deep belief in his convictions and stuff. So much so that he actually gave a series of orders. It's called a general order. And he spoke to the men and told them, for instance, that there would be no quarter, that this was an existential conflict which couldn't be negotiated with. This is like the end times, very millenarian, very... I'll link a description of the speech below. It's pretty long, but it's very interesting. But it comes into play because he imposed a lot of harsh discipline on his men with floggings and stuff like that, and also flogging his officers, which was completely unheard of. You don't flog officers. And you know, exposing them to cold as like spiritual tests and missions, and then like, you know, just being uncompromising and incredibly harsh. And for instance, when he took over Buryat, not Buryat, I think it was Ulaanbaatar, there was like a Jewish community, and effectively he ordered the mass liquidation of this populace. which unfortunately was not a strategically smart move, because those individual Jews that were there, obviously that ethnic group is the catalyst of communism in general. However, in this specific case, they had felt the repercussions of their brethren's initiatives. You know, Lenin is a Jew, and basically were the main financiers of the Tsar. And now it was a misstep, but anyway, he freaking kills them all. And he does that a lot to all commissars and all avowed communists. He just liquidates them. He kills them. And this is probably the smartest move you can make, especially when you're dealing with communists, because there really is no reprogramming someone. Once someone is a communist, they have revealed themselves to be HIV positive. You know what I mean? Like, that person has AIDS. Like, there is nothing you can do to protect them. And you just have to eliminate them like a cancer. Now, a lot of people give him a lot of shit about his like harsh tactics and stuff, but you have to understand that the martial tradition is this way. It is to be harsh on your men, because at the end of the day, you're killing other people, you're running into a wall, and so you have to be, you know, the rock in the hard place. If you want someone to be going through a hard place, you have to be a wall. You have to be a rock, and that's what Roman was as a general. But of course, a lot of like soy weesh mode freaking idiots chose to, like, you know, I don't know, resent him. And that's another issue as a commander. You have to balance the performance of your unit, their motivation, with how far you can push them. Because some horses can take being prodded on a little bit better than others, right? Just like a horse. If you kick your spurs in too hard and too often, you're going to get kicked off at some point. So you got to learn when to rule back, when to go forward, when to push hard, when to pull back. And Roman was always hard, man. He was like on Viagra, you know what I mean? Like, this guy just had no off switch. So effectively, he led his campaign, and you have to imagine it's like an ever small decreasing circle until finally he is left with the strategic nullity. And the Bud Khan was overthrown by the communist Mongol bugmen, and so he finally thought to himself, this is a literal mission, his last mission that he preached to his troops, or he didn't really preach, but he briefed his troops or his officers, which was to lead an expedition down to Tibet for reinforcements. I don't even know, like, that is crazy. I mean, you can't say anything because, like, this guy was literally fighting a millenarian battle, and after a while it takes its toll. You know, I can't blame the guy, but this guy literally believed that, and that was the point where his officers and all his men were like, that is A, insane, and B, hopeless, and C, you have to cross the Gobi Desert, and then D, like, our cause is already lost. The war, this was like such a final last stand moment that ultimately his men betray him. They pay, they're bribed by the Soviets, and funny enough, the Mongols that betrayed him and gave him over to the Russians, to the communists, because they're not even people, right? The communists, they were superstitious because they believed that if they killed him, that they would be haunted for life by this man, because he had such spiritual and strong Buddhistic forces on his side. That's pretty impressive to me. But anyway, long story short, he gets to Siberia. He lasts a week. They do a whole show trial. It's bullshit. And what I respect the most about Roman is that he went down like he lived. He did not give a damn, and he recanted nothing and fought to the end, even in his show trial, and effectively kind of like talked down to these petty peasants. Disgusting. Anyway, this is just a short story of a man whom I deeply admire, and who possibly informed the character of Colonel Kurtz. But this guy lived in real life, and there are many stories of other guys that are roughly the same, but none stick out to me like this Russian imperial officer who was loyal to the very end and who fought for something that was beautiful and good and just. But I think that's a little bit too far going on right now, and I think I definitely need to wet my whistle with some Jim Beam. Sergeant Barnes, put on that track.